The storm outside made the wind howl like a lament, and the courthouse windows trembled with the intensity of the thunder. In the Montgomery County Courthouse, Maryland, Judge Federico Matthews, known for his rigid and unwavering demeanor, was about to close another long day of hearings. His tired eyes scanned the papers on his desk as he adjusted his glasses. Federico was a man of principles, relentless when it came to enforcing the law. It didn't matter who stood before him, rich or poor, white or black, he followed the rules without hesitation. He was respected and feared in equal measure. In his 25-year career, he had seen it all: blatant lies, tears of remorse, false testimonies, broken families, and empty promises. Nothing surprised him anymore. Until that day, when the courtroom door opened, a girl walked in. She was no more than 9 years old, with ebony black skin, her hair tied into symmetrical buns, and a simple yet neat dress. Her large, curious eyes scanned the room attentively, but without fear. She was alone. A hush fell over the room. Federico leaned forward, intrigued. It was unusual for children to appear there, let alone unaccompanied. The low murmurs of those present were interrupted by the rhythmic tapping of the bailiff's cane. "Name?" the bailiff asked, trying to maintain his composure. "Nicole Johnson," the girl replied, her voice firm and sweet, without hesitation. Federico raised his eyebrows. The child spoke like an adult. He checked the papers before him, looking for her name on the day's schedule. "Nothing. You're not on today's docket." "Miss Johnson, what brings you to court?" Federico asked, his deep voice echoing against the walls of the chamber. Nicole looked up, her eyes shining with determination. She took a step forward, small and fragile amidst the imposing room. "I came to ask for help, Your Honor," she said. The simplicity of her statement sent a chill down Federico's spine. He straightened in his chair, clasping his hands before his face. What could have brought this child here alone in the middle of the storm? "Help for whom?" he asked, trying to sound gentle. "For my mother," Nicole replied, her voice unwavering. Federico motioned for her to continue. Nicole took a deep breath, her small chest rising and falling. "My MOM was arrested, sir. They said she did something wrong, but it's not true. I know it's not. I need you to let her go," the girl pleaded, a voice filled with innocence and hope. The judge closed his eyes briefly. He had seen so many children trying to defend their parents, believing in their unwavering goodness, ignoring the harsh evidence that proved otherwise. The law had no room for childish illusions. "Miss Johnson, I can't release anyone without proof that a mistake was made. If your mother is in custody, it's because there was enough evidence to justify her detention," he explained, trying to be as delicate as possible. Nicole did not waver. "I know, Your Honor, but no one has heard what I have to say," she insisted, her voice sounding oddly mature. Federico's gaze narrowed. What kind of child spoke like this? What had she seen? What did she know? "You want to testify?" he asked, now with a more serious tone. "Yes, sir," Nicole responded, her face resolute. "I need to tell the truth." The courtroom fell silent. The sound of the storm outside seemed to fade into the distance. Every eye was fixed on the girl. Federico felt a knot in his throat. There was something about this child, something that made him hesitate. It wasn't just courage. It was the maturity in her gaze, the way her words carried an invisible weight. "Very well, you shall have your chance," he decided, not knowing that those words would change his life forever. The phrase echoed through the courtroom, and Federico felt a shiver. It was as if, at that moment, destiny had shifted the course of his journey. Nicole smiled, not the relieved, childish smile one might expect, but a smile of victory, as if she knew she had won the first battle of a long war. Federico didn't know what awaited him, but he was certain that this girl was no ordinary child, and for a reason he couldn't explain, that left him profoundly uneasy. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as Nicole stood before the judge, her small figure stark against the grandeur of the judicial setting. Federico leaned back in his chair, studying the girl who had walked in alone, armed only with her determination. "Who brought you here, Nicole?" His voice softened, the authority momentarily giving way to curiosity. "I came by myself," she answered without a flicker of doubt. "I took the bus. I've been saving up my allowance," whispers rippled through the room. Federico raised a hand, and silence fell once more. He looked into her eyes, searching for signs of coaching or manipulation, but all he found was raw sincerity. "And where is your father?" he pressed. Nicole's expression darkened. Her eyes fell to the floor, her fingers tightening around the hem of her dress. He left before I was born. A pang of sympathy hit Federico unexpectedly. Stirring old memories he had long buried. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to maintain his composure. "And you believe your mother is innocent?" he continued, his voice steady. "Yes, sir. She wouldn't hurt anyone," Nicole declared. Her gaze was unwavering, defiant even. "My MOM works 2 jobs to take care of me. She's tired all the time, but she never complains. She's a good person." Federico's chest tightened. He had heard countless pleas in his career, begging, bargaining, even anger, but never like this. Never with this purity. He leaned forward, his fingers interlaced. "What exactly do you want from this court?" Nicole took a deep breath, standing straighter as if mustering all her courage. "I want a chance to prove she didn't do it. I want you to listen to me, because nobody else will." The judge hesitated, his gaze locked on hers. A child's testimony was delicate, vulnerable to influence and emotion, but something about Nicole felt different. There was a truthfulness that resonated, a gravity that belied her age. "Very well," Federico conceded. "I will allow you to speak, but know that the truth is the foundation of this court. Do you understand the importance of telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Nicole nodded. "Yes, sir." Federico looked to the prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Caroline Spencer, a woman known for her cold logic and unyielding pursuit of justice. Caroline's lips were pressed into a thin line, her sharp eyes fixed on Nicole. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this child's testimony is irrelevant. She has no knowledge of the facts. Her statements will be based on emotion, not evidence." Caroline objected, her tone clipped. Federico's gaze hardened. "Counselor, this is not a formal testimony. I am merely granting the girl a chance to be heard. I trust that the integrity of this court is resilient enough to withstand the words of a child." Caroline pursed her lips, clearly displeased, but she conceded with a curt nod. "As you wish, Your Honor." Federico turned back to Nicole. "Tell me what you know. Start from the beginning." Nicole took a step closer, her small shoulders squared, her chin lifted defiantly. "It was Tuesday. I remember because that's the day Mama picks up an extra shift at the diner. She didn't come home that night." Her voice faltered for a moment, a crack that revealed the fear beneath her brave exterior. "I was scared. But she never breaks her promises. She told me she'd be back before bedtime." Federico felt a familiar heaviness settle over him. He knew that weight broken promises that shattered a child's trust. He forced himself to remain neutral, to separate emotion from duty. "I called her phone," Nicole continued, "but a man answered. He said Mama was in trouble and hung up. The next morning, a policeman came to our house. He said Mama was arrested because she hurt someone. But that's not true. She wouldn't do that. She just wouldn't." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her voice did not waver. Federico noticed the subtle trembling of her hands, the way she clenched them at her sides to stop the shaking. This girl was carrying a burden too heavy for her small frame. "Do you know who got hurt?" Federico asked gently. Nicole nodded. "Mrs. Thompson. She owns the diner. She got robbed, but Mama didn't do it. I know because she was home when it happened." A murmur of surprise swept through the room. Federico's eyes widened. "You saw your mother at home that night?" "Yes, sir. She came home after her shift and helped me with my homework. I was struggling with math again." Nicole's voice softened, the memory pulling her back to a place of comfort. "She sat with me until I got it right. Then she made me promise to go to bed on time because she had to go back for another shift. I watched her leave from my window." Federico's heart thudded heavily. If what Nicole was saying was true, it meant her mother had an alibi. The prosecutor's voice cut through the silence. "Your Honor, the timing of the robbery corresponds with her mother's shift at the diner. This child could easily be confused about the day or the time." Federico held up a hand. "Your skepticism is noted, Counselor. However, I find the girl's account compelling. If there's a chance this information holds weight, it is our duty to investigate further." Caroline's jaw tightened, but she did not argue. Federico turned back to Nicole, his expression softening. "Nicole, do you remember anything else about that night?" The girl nodded, her brows furrowing as she recalled the memory. "There was a man outside. I saw him from my window. He was wearing a hoodie, standing by the street lamp. I thought it was strange because nobody stands there that late. When Mama left, he followed her." Federico felt a chill run down his spine. His instincts, honed by decades on the bench, told him this was no coincidence. "Can you describe him?" he asked, his voice low. Nicole shook her head. "I couldn't see his face, but he was tall, Taller than Mama, the judge's jaw tightened. This testimony complicated the case, introducing a possible new suspect or witness. It cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative, raising questions that could no longer be ignored. Federico looked down at his gavel, his fingers brushing the polished wood. This was supposed to be a routine day, another case processed, another verdict given. But now, nothing was routine anymore. He looked at Nicole, this brave child who stood before him with unwavering resolve. She had shifted the ground beneath his feet, challenging him to see beyond the black and white letter of the law. Court is adjourned until further investigation, Federico announced, his voice firm. He slammed the gavel down with a sharp crack that echoed through the room. As the courtroom emptied, Federico watched Nicole. She stood still, her chin held high, a quiet strength emanating from her small frame. In that moment, Federico knew that this was only the beginning. He would find the truth, no matter how deep he had to dig. Federico sat in his chambers, his fingers pressed against his temples, eyes closed as he replayed Nicole's words over and over. Her testimony had cast a shadow of doubt over a case he once thought was straightforward. A man outside, a mother with an alibi, a child's unwavering belief in her mother's innocence. He opened his eyes and exhaled slowly, his decision made. He needed to dig deeper. He pressed the intercom button on his desk. "Samantha, call Detective Ramirez. I need him to reopen the investigation. I want every detail re-examined. Witness statements, security footage, everything." "Yes, Your Honor," his assistant responded promptly. Moments later, a knock sounded at his door. Detective Ramirez entered, his demeanor serious, shoulders slightly hunched from years on the force. His graying hair was neatly combed, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. "You wanted to see me, Judge?" Federico gestured to the chair across from him. "Take a seat, Ramirez. We have a problem." The detective sank into the chair, curiosity flickering across his face. "This about the Tomps case?" Federico nodded. "The little girl's testimony changed everything. She claims her mother was home when the crime occurred, and she mentioned a man outside, watching, waiting, following her mother." Ramirez's eyebrows lifted. "You believe her?" "I believe she saw something, and I believe we owe it to justice to investigate further." Federico's voice was firm, resolute. "Look into it. I want every lead chased down. And get the security footage from the street where Nicole saw the man." Ramirez hesitated. "That's gonna stir up some dust." "We already filed the case." "Ada Spencer won't be happy." Federico's jaw tightened. "Let her be unhappy. I don't care about politics or convenience. I care about the truth." Ramirez's expression softened with respect. "Understood. I'll get on it right away." As the detective stood to leave, Federico's voice stopped him. "And Ramirez, be discreet. I don't want Nicole or her mother endangered if this goes deeper than we think." Ramirez's face darkened. "You think this could be bigger than a simple robbery?" Federico's gaze hardened. "I think a mother's life is on the line, and a little girl's faith in justice depends on us getting it right." Later that evening, Federico sat alone in his office, the shadows growing longer as the sun dipped below the horizon. He stared at the case file spread across his desk, his mind churning through the possibilities. If Nicole was telling the truth, then someone else was responsible. But why would they frame her mother? And who was the man in the hoodie? A soft knock broke his concentration. Samantha poked her head in, her expression apologetic. "Your Honor, Ada Spencer is here. She insists on speaking with you." Federico's shoulders tensed. He should have expected this. "Send her in." Caroline Spencer walked in, her high heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Her suit was immaculate, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, not a strand out of place. She closed the door behind her, crossing her arms as she faced Federico. "What are you doing, Federico?" Her voice was cold, her eyes narrowed. "Reopening the investigation." "Do you realize how that makes me look?" "You're undermining my case." Federico met her glare with unwavering resolve. "This isn't about you, Caroline. It's about justice." "That child's testimony introduced reasonable doubt. We can't ignore that." Caroline scoffed, her arms tightening defensively. "She's a child. She's confused. We have witnesses, security footage, and fingerprints. Her mother was at the scene. This is an open and shut case. Then why are you so threatened by me double-checking the facts?" Federico's tone was calm, measured. "If your case is solid, it will withstand scrutiny." Her jaw clenched, her eyes blazing with anger. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about this case. It's about the precedent you're setting. You're giving every defendant a loophole, letting emotional pleas sway judicial decisions. Federico stood, his presence towering even without raising his voice. This isn't about emotions, it's about facts. And if I find out that you overlooked evidence or rushed this case to trial, I'll see to it that justice is served, no matter who it inconveniences. Caroline's face flushed with indignation. You're making a mistake. You're letting a sob story cloud your judgment. Federico's eyes turned icy. I'm following the law. If that offends you, perhaps you should reconsider your career. She opened her mouth to retort, but no words came out. She turned on her heel, storming out of his office without another word, the door slamming behind her. Federico sank back into his chair, his heart pounding. Caroline was powerful, well-connected. He knew he had made an enemy tonight, but he also knew he had done the right thing. His gaze fell to a photo on his desk, a picture of his own daughter, smiling brightly. A knot of emotion tightened in his throat. If it were his child fighting for justice, he would want someone to listen. He picked up his pen, determination hardening his resolve. He would see this through, no matter how messy it became, because the truth was worth fighting for. Detective Ramirez leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the screen before him. The security footage flickered in black and white, showing the street outside Nicole's apartment on the night of the crime. He fast-forwarded through hours of mundane activity, cars passing, neighbors walking dogs, shadows stretching under dim streetlights. Then, just after midnight, movement caught his eye. A figure in a hoodie, standing across the street, half hidden behind a tree. The man stood perfectly still, watching the building. Ramirez's heart quickened. Got you. He rewound the footage, replaying the scene in slow motion. The man didn't move for almost 20 minutes, then suddenly turned and walked out of the camera's view. He couldn't see the man's face, but his posture tense and alert sent a chill down Ramirez's spine. This wasn't some random passerby. He was waiting for something, or someone. Ramirez picked up his phone and dialed Federico. The judge answered almost immediately. You have something? You were right, Ramirez said, his voice low. There was someone outside that night, a man wearing a hoodie. He was watching the building for at least 20 minutes before leaving. I couldn't see his face, but he definitely wasn't just passing by. A pause. Then Federico's voice, firm and resolute. Find him the next morning. Federico walked into his courtroom with a heavy heart. He spotted Nicole in the front row, her wide eyes watching him expectantly. Next to her sat her mother, hands clasped tightly, anxiety written across her face. Federico felt the weight of their hope pressing down on him. He took his seat, his gaze sweeping across the room, settling on Ada Spencer at the prosecutor's table. Her expression was cold, calculated. The hearing began, routine procedures unfolding. Federico tried to focus, but his mind kept drifting back to the footage. Who was the man outside? Why was he watching Nicole's apartment? His thoughts were interrupted by a commotion at the courtroom doors. Detective Ramirez entered, his face grim, carrying a folder under his arm. He approached the bench, leaning in close to whisper. We found a witness, an elderly neighbor who saw the man that night. She said he was pacing, looked nervous, kept checking his phone. Federico's eyes narrowed. Did she recognize him? Ramirez shook his head. No, but she noticed something else. He got into a car when he left, a black sedan with tinted windows. She remembered because it was parked there for hours, and she thought it was suspicious. Federico's pulse quickened. Run the plates. I want to know who owns that car. Ramirez nodded, slipping out of the courtroom as quietly as he had entered. Federico's gaze returned to Nicole. Her small hands clutched her mother's arm, her eyes wide with fear and hope. He felt a surge of determination. He wouldn't let her down. The truth was out there, and he was getting closer. That evening, Federico returned to his office, exhaustion tugging at him. His phone buzzed, Ramirez's name flashing on the screen. He answered quickly. Tell me you found something. Ramirez's voice was tense. We ran the plates. The car is registered to a man named Marcos Reynolds. He has a record: petty theft, drug possession. But here's the kicker. He used to work for the victim. Federico's blood ran cold. Are you saying the victim knew his attacker? Looks like it, Ramirez confirmed. Reynolds was fired 2 months before the murder. Rumor has it there was bad blood between them. An argument over money. Federico's mind raced, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. If Reynolds had a motive, then we might have the wrong person on trial, Ramirez finished grimly. Silence hung heavy between them. Federico closed his eyes, the weight of his next decision settling on his shoulders. Issue a warrant. Bring him in for questioning, already on it, Ramirez assured him. But Federico, this won't sit well with Ada Spencer. She's convinced she has her perpetrator. Federico's jaw tightened. I don't care about her career ambitions. If Reynolds is involved, we need to find out how. And if he's the real killer, then we've made a terrible mistake. Hours later, Federico sat alone in his office, the city lights flickering outside his window. His thoughts were tangled, his conscience heavy. He had dedicated his life to the law, to justice. But what if he had been wrong? What if he had almost sentenced an innocent woman because he trusted the system too much? He looked at the files scattered across his desk, the faces of Nicole and her mother staring back at him. Federico felt a wave of guilt. They had been fighting to be heard, to be believed, and no one had listened. Until now. He stood, his reflection staring back at him from the window. He was a judge, a man of authority and power, but he was also human, capable of error, and it was his responsibility to right this wrong, no matter the cost. His phone buzzed again. A message from Ramirez. We got Reynolds. He's denying everything, but he's nervous, sweating bullets. We're bringing him in for questioning. Federico's heart pounded. This was it. The truth was within reach. But as he read the message again, a chill ran down his spine. If Reynolds was guilty, then he had gone to great lengths to frame Nicole's mother. And that meant he wasn't just a petty criminal. He was calculated, dangerous. Federico's hands tightened into fists. He wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting to protect Nicole and her mother from a man who would do anything to avoid the consequences of his actions. And Federico would make sure he faced them, no matter what. Detective Ramirez sat across from Marcus Reynolds in the stark interrogation room, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the walls. Reynolds slouched in his chair, his hoodie pulled low, eyes shifting nervously. Ramirez placed a photo of the victim on the table, sliding it toward Reynolds. You knew him. Reynolds' jaw tightened, his gaze flicking to the photo before he looked away. I work for him. That's it. Ramirez leaned back, crossing his arms. You were fired 2 months before his death. Witnesses say you were angry, felt you were cheated out of pay. Reynolds' lips twitched, his fingers tapping against the table. Yeah, I was pissed. Doesn't mean I killed him. Ramirez's eyes narrowed. Why were you outside Nicole's apartment the night he was murdered? Reynolds' head snapped up, panic flickering in his eyes. I don't know what you're talking about. Ramirez slid another photo across the table, grainy security footage of Reynolds standing under the street lamp, his face partially obscured by his hoodie. This was you, wasn't it? Watching the building, waiting. Reynolds' face turned pale, his hands shaking. I was just passing by for 20 minutes? Ramirez challenged, his voice hardening. You stood there, watching? Then you left in your car, a black sedan registered in your name. You think we wouldn't trace the plates? Reynolds' shoulders sagged, his facade cracking. He glanced around the room as if looking for an escape. Look, man, I didn't kill nobody. I was just doing a job. Ramirez's eyes sharpened. What job? Reynolds hesitated, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. I was paid to watch the place, make sure nobody was home. Ramirez leaned forward, his fists pressing against the table. Who paid you? Reynolds' lips parted, but no sound came out. His face was a mask of fear, sweat beading on his forehead. I can't. They'll kill me. Ramirez's voice softened, a calculating edge to his tone. You're already in deep, Marcus. If you don't talk, you'll go down for murder. But if you tell me who hired you, maybe I can help. Reynolds' shoulders trembled, his eyes wide with desperation. He looked down at his hands, his fingers digging into his palms. I never saw his face, but he called me, gave me instructions, said to watch the building and call him if anyone came home. Ramirez's pulse quickened. Did you call him? Reynolds shook his head. No one showed up. Place was empty the whole time. After a while, he told me to leave, said I get my money through a drop. Ramirez's jaw tightened. And did you? Yeah, Reynolds whispered, his voice hollow. Envelope full of cash, just like he promised. But no name, no contact info. Nothing. Ramirez's eyes narrowed, suspicion churning in his gut. This wasn't just about revenge or a paycheck. This was orchestrated, planned. Someone had hired Reynolds to stake out Nicole's apartment. Someone who knew the victim would be there. Someone who wanted to make sure no one else would witness what happened that night. Someone who was still out there. Later that day, Federico sat in his office, his fingers steepled under his chin. Ramirez's report was spread out on his desk, every word burning into his memory. Reynolds was just a pawn lookout hired by an unseen mastermind, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Frederico's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on his door. Ada Spencer entered, her heels clicking against the floor. Her eyes were cold, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I heard about Reynolds." Frederico gestured to the chair across from him. "He was hired to watch the building. He didn't commit the murder." Spencer's jaw clenched. "That doesn't change the evidence against Nicole's mother. Her fingerprints are on the murder weapon. She had a motive, an alibi that doesn't hold up." Frederico's gaze was steady. "But it also means someone else was involved. Someone who went through a lot of trouble to make sure no one saw the crime." Spencer's eyes flashed with irritation. "You're chasing shadows, Frederico. We have a solid case. Don't let this mystery man cloud your judgment." Frederico's voice was firm. "I won't let an innocent woman go to prison just to preserve your conviction rate." Spencer's face reddened, her fists clenching. "Watch yourself, Judge. This is my case. Don't forget that." She turned on her heel and stormed out, the door slamming behind her. Frederico exhaled, his body tense with frustration. Spencer was too focused on winning, too blind to see the holes forming in her case. His phone buzzed, Ramirez's name flashing on the screen. He answered quickly. "What did you find?" Ramirez's voice was tense. "We traced the call Reynolds received. It was from a burner phone." "Untraceable." Frederico's shoulder sagged. "Of course it was. This guy knows how to cover his tracks. There's more," Ramirez continued, his tone grim. "The victim's financials were clean, but his business partner, not so much. Turns out he was embezzling company funds. The victim found out just days before his death." Frederico's eyes widened. "And you think he had him killed to cover it up?" "It's a strong motive," Ramirez confirmed. "And if he knew Nicole's mother would be the first suspect, it would be the perfect frame job." Frederico's mind raced, the pieces clicking into place. "Who is he?" "David Carlson," Ramirez said. "He's been running the company since the murder, and from what I've seen, he's been doing pretty well for himself." Frederico's blood ran cold. A partner with motive, a man who stood to gain everything from his colleague's death, and a mastermind cunning enough to manipulate the evidence, framing an innocent woman. It was a perfect crime, and Frederico was the only one who could stop it. But he'd have to be smart. Carlson was powerful, connected. One wrong move, and the entire case could fall apart. Frederico stood, his resolve hardening. He wouldn't let Nicole lose her mother. He wouldn't let an innocent woman pay for another man's sins. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about doing what was right, no matter the cost. Frederico stood in front of the courthouse, his eyes fixed on David Carlson as he exited a sleek black car, his suit impeccable, his demeanor confident. Carlson laughed into his phone, shaking hands with a board member before walking inside. Frederico's jaw clenched. Carlson looked every bit the successful businessman, charming, composed, untouchable. But behind that polished smile was a murderer. He needed proof, and he needed it fast. That evening, Frederico met Ramirez at a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town. The detective's face was drawn, exhaustion etched into his features. "I pulled Carlson's phone records. He's careful. No direct ties to Reynolds. But," Frederico's eyes narrowed, "but," Ramirez slid a file across the table. 3 days before the murder, Carlson made a call to a private investigator, a real bottom feeder, known for digging up dirt, intimidating witnesses, and arranging alibis. Frederico's fingers tightened around the folder. "You think Carlson hired him to cover his tracks?" Ramirez nodded. "The PO went off the grid a day after the murder. If we find him, we might get a confession, or at least enough to connect Carlson to the crime." Frederico's mind raced, the pieces starting to fall into place. Carlson hired a PI to ensure everything went smoothly, to keep his hands clean. He orchestrated the perfect frame job, banking on Nicole's mother's fragile alibi to seal the deal. But he hadn't counted on Frederico digging deeper. "We need to find this investigator," Frederico said, his voice hardening. "He's the key to taking Carlson down." Ramirez grinned, his eyes gleaming with determination. "Already on it. I have a lead on where he might be hiding, but it won't be easy. This guy's a ghost." Frederico's jaw set in determination. "Then we'll smoke him out." Meanwhile, Nicole sat in her bedroom, her heart heavy as she stared at a photo of her mother. Tears pricked at her eyes, memories flooding back her mother's warm smile, her gentle touch, the way she used to sing her to sleep. She refused to believe her mother was capable of murder, but the evidence was damning. The fingerprints, the motive, the lies. Nicole's phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was a message from Federico. I'm close to finding the truth. Trust me. A spark of hope ignited in her chest. If anyone could prove her mother's innocence, it was Federico. She just hoped he wasn't too late. The next day, Ramirez tracked down the PI to a rundown motel on the edge of town. The place was a dump. The air heavy with the scent of stale cigarettes and broken dreams. They kicked down the door, guns drawn. The PI scrambled to his feet, eyes wide with panic. I didn't do nothing. I swear. Federico stepped forward, his voice cold. You worked for Carlson. You helped him set up Nicole's mother. The PI's face went pale, his hands shaking. I didn't know he was gonna kill the guy. He just paid me to watch the place, make sure no one went inside. That's all. Federico's eyes narrowed. And then he paid you to disappear. The PI's shoulders slumped, his body deflating. Yeah, he did. Gave me a fat envelope and told me to keep my mouth shut. Federico's jaw tightened. Well, you're gonna start talking now. Hours later, Federico stood in his office, the PI signed confession in his hands. Carlson had orchestrated everything. He'd planned the murder down to the last detail, framing Nicole's mother to eliminate suspicion, and he would have gotten away with it if Federico hadn't kept digging. His phone buzzed. It was Ada Spencer. Her voice was tense, her words clipped. I heard about the confession. You better be damn sure about this, Federico. Carlson's powerful. If this falls apart in court. Federico's voice was steady. It won't. I'll make sure of it. There was a pause, then a sigh. All right. I'll issue a warrant for his arrest. But you better have every piece of evidence nailed down. Carlson won't go down without a fight. Federico's lips curled into a grim smile. I'm counting on it. The next morning, Federico watched as a team of officers stormed Carlson's office. The man barely flinched as they slapped the cuffs on him, his face a mask of calm arrogance. You've made a mistake, Judge, Carlson said smoothly, his eyes cold. I have the best lawyers in the country. You'll never make this stick. Federico's gaze was unyielding. We'll see about that. As Carlson was led away, Federico felt a surge of triumph. He'd exposed the truth. The real murderer was finally facing justice. But as he turned to leave, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Nicole. They're saying my MOM might be released. Is it over? Federico's heart twisted. It wasn't over. Not yet. Carlson was a snake, a master manipulator. His trial would be a battle. But Federico was ready. He wouldn't rest until justice was served, no matter what it took. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension as David Carlson sat at the defense table, his face impassive, dressed in an immaculate suit. He looked more like a high-powered executive than an accused murderer. His eyes were cold, calculating, as they swept across the room, landing momentarily on Federico. A faint smirk tugged at his lips. Federico's jaw tightened. Carlson's arrogance was palpable. Even now, shackled by accusations and surrounded by law enforcement, he exuded confidence. Because he still believed he could win. Federico took his seat, his eyes never leaving Carlson. Ada Spencer stood up, her posture rigid, her gaze steely as she addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, today you will hear the truth behind the cold-blooded murder of Andrew Reynolds. A truth meticulously buried beneath lies, manipulation, and corruption. She pointed at Carlson, her voice steady. The defendant, David Carlson, orchestrated the murder and framed an innocent woman to protect his empire. Gustus rippled through the room. Carlson's lawyer, a sharp-eyed man named Hamilton West, immediately stood. Objection. Baseless accusations meant to prejudice the jury. The judge's gavel came down hard. Sustained. The jury will disregard the prosecution's statement. Spencer's lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced at Federico, her eyes blazing. They were in for a fight. The trial was brutal. Carlson's legal team was relentless, systematically attacking every piece of evidence. They questioned the credibility of the PI's confession, suggesting it was coerced. They painted Nicole's mother as a woman scorned, desperate enough to kill to get back at Reynolds. Hamilton West paced in front of the jury, his voice calm, persuasive. My client is a respected businessman, a pillar of this community. He had no motive, no reason to harm Andrew Reynolds. This entire case rests on the words of a desperate detective and a biased judge with a personal vendetta. His eyes flicked toward Federico, a sly smile playing at his lips. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not justice. This is a witch hunt. Federico's hands curled into fists. He wanted to shout, to scream the truth, but he knew better. This was the game Carlson played, twisting reality, bending perception. and he was good at it. The prosecution called the PI to the stand. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around the courtroom as he recounted his role in the cover-up. Coulson hired me to watch the house. Make sure no one went inside. After the murder, he paid me to disappear. Spencer's voice was firm. And did he threaten you? The PI swallowed, his voice trembling. Yeah, he said if I talked, I'd end up like Reynolds. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Coulson's face remained stone-like, his eyes fixed on the witness. Unblinking, West sprang to his feet. Objection. Hearsay. The judge's gavel slammed down. Sustained. Spencer's shoulders tensed. She turned to the PI. Did you see Coulson at the scene of the crime? The PI shook his head. No, but he called me right after. Told me to stay quiet. West's smile widened. No further questions, Your Honor. Frederico's stomach dropped. The testimony wasn't enough. Coulson was slipping through their fingers. As the trial progressed, Frederico watched Coulson's performance with growing dread. The man was a master manipulator. His expressions calculated, his responses flawless. He played the part of the wrongly accused perfectly, his demeanor sympathetic, his voice steady. He lied effortlessly, and the jury was eating it up. Frederico's heart raced as the defense called its final witness, Coulson himself. The man took the stand, his face somber, his voice low as he spoke of his friendship with Reynolds. He was like a brother to me, Coulson said, his eyes glistening with forced tears. I would never hurt him. I trusted him. I never imagined he was having an affair with my wife. The courtroom fell silent. The confession was a bombshell. Gasps echoed as Coulson's shoulders sagged, his voice cracking. When I found out, I was devastated. But I didn't kill him. I confronted him. We argued, but I left. I went home, and the next morning, he was dead. Tears rolled down his face. They're trying to frame me because I'm the easiest target. Because I was hurt. Because my wife betrayed me. But I didn't kill him. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with faint sobs. Frederico's blood ran cold. Coulson had turned the tables, shifting suspicion away from himself, and the jury was moved. He saw it in their faces, the pity, the doubt. They were beginning to believe him. After the testimony, Frederico met Spencer outside the courtroom. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. We're losing. The jury's buying his story. He's good, too good. Frederico's mind raced. Coulson was slipping through the cracks. They needed something irrefutable, something that couldn't be twisted. Then it hit him. The surveillance tapes, he said suddenly. From the neighborhood. They were never recovered. If we can find them, we might have proof of Coulson's movements that night. Spencer's eyes lit up. But the PI said they were destroyed. Frederico's lips curled into a determined smile. Coulson's good, but he's not perfect. He missed something. I know it. Spencer's jaw tightened. I'll get a warrant. If there's anything left of those tapes, we'll find it. Frederico's heart pounded. This was their last chance. If the tapes showed Coulson near the crime scene, his lies would crumble. But if they found nothing, Nicole's mother would go to prison for a crime she didn't commit. And Coulson would walk free. The search for the surveillance tapes was grueling. Frederico and Spencer knew they were racing against the clock. With each passing day, the jury's sympathy for Coulson grew, and the defense's narrative solidified. They needed the tapes, or everything would be lost. Frederico didn't sleep. He combed through police reports, witness statements, anything that might point to the whereabouts of the tapes. His mind raced, replaying every detail. The neighborhood cameras should have caught something. If Coulson was there that night, the footage would prove it. But where were the tapes? 3 days later, Spencer burst into Frederico's office. Her face flushed with excitement. We found them, she exclaimed, waving a file. The tapes. They weren't destroyed. The PI stashed them in a storage unit outside the city. Frederico's heart skipped a beat. What's on them? Spencer's eyes gleamed. Everything. Coulson was there that night. The footage shows him arriving at Reynolds' house at 10:42 p.m. and not leaving until after midnight. Frederico felt a surge of triumph. This was it. The proof they needed. Coulson's alibi would shatter, and his lies would be exposed. We have him, Frederico whispered, his fists clenching. We have him. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. The defense was visibly shaken as the prosecution announced the new evidence. Coulson's confident facade faltered for the first time, his eyes narrowing at the mention of the tapes. Spencer played the footage for the jury. The grainy black and white video flickered on the screen, showing Coulson's car pulling up to Reynolds' house. He stepped out, glancing around before entering the property. The timestamp clearly displayed 10:42 p.m. Spencer's voice was steady, unwavering. This places the defendant at the scene of the crime during the time of the murder. His previous statements claimed he was at home all night. Coulson's lawyer, West, shot to his feet. Objection. The footage is circumstantial. It doesn't prove murder. Spencer turned, her gaze icy. It proves he lied. It proves he was there when he said he wasn't. What was he hiding? The jury's eyes were glued to the screen, their faces hardening. The air was heavy with suspicion. Coulson's calm demeanor cracked. His jaw tightened, his fists clenching under the table. Federico watched with satisfaction as the man who once seemed untouchable began to unravel. West tried to discredit the footage, claiming it was tampered with. But his arguments were weak. The evidence was too damning. The timestamps matched the timeline of the murder perfectly. Coulson's presence at the scene contradicted his sworn testimony. Spencer didn't let up. She played the next clip, showing Coulson leaving the house at 12:17 a.m., wiping his hands on a cloth before getting into his car. He looked around again, his expression cold, calculated. She paused the video, the image frozen on Coulson's face. This is the man who claims he's innocent. A man who was at the crime scene for nearly 2 hours, lying about his whereabouts, and showing no signs of grief or shock. Does this look like someone who just lost a friend? The courtroom was silent. The jury's eyes were fixed on the screen, their expressions hardening. Doubt was replaced by certainty. Coulson wasn't just lying, he was guilty. Federico felt a rush of vindication. They were winning. Coulson's empire of lies was crumbling before his eyes. But as he watched the man's face, a cold chill ran down his spine. Coulson wasn't panicking. He was plotting. Federico saw the flicker of calculation in his eyes, the subtle shift in his posture. Coulson was preparing his next move. This wasn't over. Not yet. The defense called Coulson back to the stand. He looked disheveled, his usual confidence replaced by a weary, broken facade. His voice trembled as he addressed the jury. I didn't kill Andrew, he said, his voice cracking. Yes, I went to his house the night. I wanted to confront him about the affair. I was angry, hurt, but I didn't kill him. Tears welled up in his eyes, his shoulders shaking with grief. We argued, shouted at each other, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't hurt him. I left. I went home. He covered his face with his hands, his voice muffled. I lied because I was ashamed of my jealousy, my rage. But I didn't kill him. I swear I didn't. The performance was masterful. The jury's faces softened, sympathy returning. Coulson was turning the narrative again, painting himself as a flawed but innocent man. Federico's fists clenched. Coulson was manipulating them, playing on their emotions, twisting the truth to suit his needs. Spencer stood up, her eyes blazing. Mr. Coulson, if you didn't kill Andrew Reynolds, then who did? Coulson's face fell, his lips quivering. He looked at Nicole's mother, his expression filled with sorrow. I thought it was her. I saw her leave his house that night after I left. I thought she did it out of jealousy. But now, I don't know. Gasps filled the courtroom. Nicole's mother's face went pale, her body trembling. Liar, she screamed, her voice cracking. I never went there. You're lying. The judge banged his gavel. Order in the court. But the damage was done. Coulson had planted the seed of doubt, redirecting suspicion back to her. The jury's faces were conflicted once more, uncertainty clouding their eyes. Federico's stomach dropped. Coulson was slipping through their fingers again. The man was a master of deception, always one step ahead. Spencer looked shaken, her confidence wavering. We need something more, she whispered to Federico. Something that destroys his narrative completely. Federico's mind raced. Coulson was twisting the story, weaving lies around half-truths. They needed proof, indisputable evidence that would corner him, leave no room for manipulation. Then he remembered the cloth, the one Coulson wiped his hands on before leaving the crime scene. If they found it, tested it, his eyes widened. We need to find that cloth. It might have traces of blood. Reynolds' blood. Spencer's eyes lit up. If it does, we can prove Coulson was at the scene when the murder happened. Federico nodded, his heart racing. This was their last shot. If they found the cloth, Coulson's lies would fall apart. But if they didn't, he didn't want to think about that. They had to find it. They had to end this. Time was running out. The trial was nearing its end, and Coulson's narrative was gaining traction. Despite the surveillance footage placing him at the crime scene, his emotional testimony had sown doubt. The jury's faces were conflicted, their sympathy shifting once more. Federico knew they needed the cloth. It was the missing piece, the one thing that could definitively place Carlson at the scene during the murder. But they had no idea where it was. He and Spencer worked tirelessly, retracing Carlson's movements that night. They interviewed neighbors, reviewed more footage, and analyzed every detail. But nothing led them to the cloth. It was like it had vanished. 3 days later, Spencer burst into Federico's office, her eyes wide with urgency. "I found it," she exclaimed, waving a report. The cloth. A homeless man found it near a dumpster a few blocks from the crime scene. He thought it was trash, but kept it to clean his belongings. Federico's heart pounded. "Do we have it now?" Spencer nodded, her face serious. "I sent it to the lab for testing. If there's blood on it, and if it matches Reynolds' DNA." Federico didn't need her to finish. This was it. The evidence that would break Carlson's alibi once and for all. The wait for the lab results was agonizing. Every hour felt like an eternity as Federico checked his phone constantly, waiting for the call. He barely slept, his mind replaying every detail of the case. Finally, the call came. Spencer's voice was triumphant. "We got him. The blood on the cloth is Reynolds. And there's more. Carlson's fingerprints are all over it." Federico felt a rush of relief. This was the proof they needed. The lie was shattered. Carlson had been at the scene during the murder, and no amount of emotional manipulation could explain this away. The courtroom was silent as Spencer presented the new evidence. The cloth, sealed in a plastic bag, was displayed for the jury to see. "This cloth was found near the crime scene," Spencer explained, her voice steady. "It has the victim's blood on it, and the defendant's fingerprints." Gasps filled the room. Carlson's face went pale, his confidence evaporating. His lawyer, West, looked shaken, his arguments crumbling before his eyes. Spencer continued, her gaze fixed on Carlson. "This places the defendant at the scene, not just as a visitor, but as someone in direct contact with the victim's blood. This is the physical proof we needed." Carlson's mouth opened, but no words came out. His composure broke, his hands trembling. He looked at the jury, but their faces were hard, their expressions resolute. The lie was over. The truth was exposed. West tried to object, claiming the evidence was planted, but the judge dismissed his argument. The chain of custody was clear. The tests were verified. The cloth was real, and its implications were undeniable. Federico watched as Carlson's empire of deception collapsed. The man who thought he could manipulate the system, twist the truth to suit his needs, was now cornered by his own lies. But Carlson wasn't done. As Spencer delivered her closing argument, he stood up, his face contorted with anger. "This is a setup," he shouted, his voice shaking. "You are framing me. I didn't kill him." The judge ordered him to sit down, but Carlson's rage spilled over. "You're all fools. You think this proves anything? I was set up." His outburst only solidified the jury's decision. They saw through his lies, his manipulations. His desperation was evident, his guilt unmistakable. Federico felt a wave of relief. Justice was finally within reach. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with the verdict. "Guilty." The word echoed through the courtroom, final and absolute. Carlson's face fell, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The once powerful man was now nothing more than a convicted murderer. Federico looked at Spencer, a triumphant smile on her face. They had done it. They had fought through lies, manipulation, and deception, and they had won. Justice had prevailed. As the courtroom emptied, Federico watched Carlson being led away in handcuffs. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Federico saw the hatred, the rage burning in Carlson's eyes. But beneath that, there was fear, the fear of a man who had lost everything. Federico turned away, feeling a strange sense of closure. The battle was over, but the scars it left behind would remain. He and Spencer walked out of the courthouse, the sun shining brightly above. They had exposed the truth, shattered the lies, and brought justice to Andrew Reynolds. But as they stood on the steps, Federico couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Carlson was defeated, but his legacy of deception and manipulation wouldn't be so easily erased. Spencer noticed his expression and placed a hand on his shoulder. "We did it, Federico. It's over." He forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, it's over." But deep down, he knew the fight against lies and corruption was far from finished. Federico couldn't escape the feeling that, while the trial was over, something more sinister was at play. His mind lingered on the words Carlson had shouted in court. "You're all fools. You think this proves anything? I was set up." Those words echoed in his mind like a haunting refrain. He tried to shake it off. Carlson was guilty. The evidence was irrefutable, yet something didn't sit right. The case had been almost too perfect to clean. The days following the trial were filled with celebrations. The press hailed the conviction as a victory for justice, but Federico couldn't feel the satisfaction everyone else seemed to be basking in. Instead, there was a gnawing unease in his chest. Spencer, on the other hand, was optimistic. She could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Coulson's conviction meant one less criminal on the streets. "We did good work, Federico. This is what it's all about." But Federico wasn't sure. There was still too much left unanswered. 2 weeks later, Federico was sitting in his office, sifting through case files, when a phone call interrupted his thoughts. The voice on the other end was low, almost secretive. "It's about Coulson." Federico's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "His trial is over. There's something you missed." "Something big." "I didn't want to get involved, but this." The voice hesitated, then continued. "You need to look into the people Coulson was working with." Federico's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about?" "Just trust me. Look into his connections." "There's more to the story than you know." "You need to dig deeper, before it's too late." The voice hung up before Federico could ask another question. His hand trembled as he set the phone down. He didn't know whether to ignore the warning or follow it. He had already exposed Coulson for what he was. But something about the call made him feel like there was unfinished business. Federico decided to follow the lead. It didn't make sense, but the nagging feeling in his gut told him he had to. He pulled up Coulson's financial records, his personal contacts, any connection he could find. What he discovered sent a shock through his body. Coulson's criminal empire wasn't just about the murder. It went deeper. He had connections to corrupt law enforcement officials, shady businessmen, and powerful figures in the city's political sphere. The network Coulson had built wasn't just about one man's greed. It was a carefully orchestrated web of lies and manipulation, designed to ensure that he remained untouchable. And even though he was convicted of Reynolds' murder, the people behind him hadn't been exposed. Federico felt a surge of anger. He had been so focused on Coulson that he had missed the real conspiracy. But now, with this new information, he knew the fight wasn't over. He couldn't let Coulson's conviction be the end. Not when so many others were still free. Federico brought the information to Spencer. She was shocked, but there was something else in her eyes. Determination. "This goes beyond Coulson, Federico. These people won't stop at anything to protect themselves." "No," Federico replied, the weight of the realization settling over him. "But we can't let them get away with it. If we can expose these connections, we can bring down their entire network." Spencer nodded. "Let's do it. But we need to be careful. This is bigger than we thought." "They'll fight back," Federico agreed. They couldn't rush into this. But the thought of Coulson and the network of corruption he had built gnawed at him. They had to expose it all. They spent the next few weeks gathering evidence. They followed the money, traced the connections, and interviewed anyone who might have useful information. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't safe, but Federico felt a sense of urgency. Every day they waited, the network grew stronger, more entrenched. Then, one evening, they received an anonymous tip. The tipster claimed to have crucial information about Coulson's business dealings, documents that could unravel everything. But when they arrived at the location provided by the tipster, they found nothing but an empty warehouse. The tip had been a trap. Federico's heart sank. He had been too trusting, too eager. The people Coulson was connected to were watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. As they walked back to their car, Spencer's voice cut through the silence. "This isn't over, Federico. They want us to back off, but we can't. We're getting closer. We have to push forward." Federico nodded, his mind racing. They had been set up, but that only meant they were on the right track. The conspiracy was bigger than he had imagined, and now they were involved in something far more dangerous than just a murder trial. But he wasn't about to back down. He had already come too far. The stakes were higher than ever. As Federico and Spencer prepared for the next phase of their investigation, they knew that exposing Coulson's entire network would be a fight, one that would require all their skill, every ounce of determination. And the people behind Coulson were powerful. They wouldn't let their empire fall without a fight. Federico glanced at Spencer, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't just a prosecutor anymore. He was a man who had seen corruption firsthand, and he wasn't going to stop until he brought it all to light. The game had changed, and he was ready to play. The air in Federico's office felt thick with tension. Spencer had been working late, her eyes scanning through piles of documents, trying to connect the final dots. The tip-off had been a blow, but it hadn't broken their resolve. The more they dug, the more they realized how far the corruption went. They were closing in, but Federico knew this was a dangerous game. They had already crossed too many lines, poked at too many sleeping giants. There was no turning back now. It was a cold evening, and as Federico sat at his desk, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The deeper they went, the more they exposed, the more people were watching. If they weren't careful, one wrong move could cost them everything. I've found it. Spencer's voice broke the silence, sharp and resolute. Federico's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? The money trail. It's all connected. I've traced it back to someone inside the mayor's office. Someone with direct ties to Carlson. Someone who was involved in more than just his financial dealings. This goes all the way to the top. Federico leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. The mayor? No, Spencer said, shaking her head. Someone higher. Someone untouchable. The kind of person who controls the system from the shadows. Who? A businessman. Arthur Seligman. Federico felt a chill run down his spine. Seligman was a name that had been whispered in the corridors of power for years. His influence was immense, his wealth seemingly infinite. It was said he had his hand in everything from local politics to international investments. His reputation was spotless, his public persona impeccable. But now, Federico knew the truth. Seligman wasn't just a powerful businessman, he was the linchpin in Carlson's network. Spencer looked at him with a mix of fear and determination. This is bigger than we thought, Federico. If we go after Seligman, we're not just taking down Carlson's operation, we're risking our careers, our lives. Federico stood up, his thoughts racing. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The revelation of Seligman's involvement would be the key that unlocked everything. But it wasn't going to be easy, and it certainly wasn't going to be safe. We can't stop now, Federico said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. If we do, then all of this means nothing. We expose Seligman. We take down the whole damn network. This is the endgame, but Spencer was right to be cautious. Going after Seligman would mean going against one of the most powerful figures in the city. They would need concrete evidence, something irrefutable that no one could dismiss. You're right, Federico said after a long pause. But we need to be smart. We need to hit him where it hurts. Spencer nodded. I've been digging into Seligman's finances. I think I've found something. A hidden account. If we can get our hands on that, it'll prove everything. Where is it? Federico asked, his mind already formulating a plan. It's in a private offshore bank account, but we'll need someone on the inside to get us the documents. Federico's stomach turned. Breaking into a system like that wouldn't just be illegal, it would be dangerous. But the stakes had never been higher. They had no choice. I know someone who might be able to help, Federico said after a moment. A former colleague of mine. He owes me a favor, but it's a risk. If he gets caught, it could destroy his life. Spencer was silent for a moment, weighing the risk. Do we have any other choice? No, Federico replied firmly. We go after Seligman. We expose him for what he really is. And when we do, the whole network will come crashing down. The plan was set into motion. Federico reached out to his former colleague, a hacker named Jameson, who had once worked with him on a few cases. Jameson had moved on to more lucrative and more dangerous work since leaving law enforcement, but Federico knew he could count on him. It took days to get everything in place. Jameson worked his magic, slipping into the offshore bank system and downloading the documents they needed. Federico could barely sleep during those days, constantly checking his phone, waiting for news. Then, finally, the call came. We've got it, Jameson said on the other end of the line. I've got the account details. I've also uncovered some additional transfers, links to several businesses connected to Seligman. This is the big one, Federico. It's all there. Federico's heart raced. Are you sure? Is everything secure? Secure. You can't trace this back to me. But be careful, Federico. This kind of information. It's a death sentence if it gets out. I understand. Just get it to me. The next few days were a blur. Federico and Spencer spent every waking moment going over the evidence, confirming every detail, making sure they had everything they needed. The document trail was long and intricate, but it all pointed to the same conclusion. Arthur Seligman was the mastermind behind Carlson's network. With the evidence in hand, Federico knew they had to act fast. The longer they waited, the more Seligman would have to cover his tracks. They went to the press, releasing the documents and detailing Seligman's involvement in the operation. The story hit like a bombshell. Within hours, the media was buzzing, and the public's outrage was palpable. Seligman tried to mount a defense, but the evidence was overwhelming. His empire, which had seemed so untouchable, was crumbling. And as Federico watched the world react, he finally allowed himself to feel a sense of accomplishment. He had done it. The network was exposed, and Seligman's reign of power had come to an end. But it wasn't just about the victory. It was about the truth. The people who had been crushed under the weight of corruption. The victims whose voices had been silenced. And now, their stories were finally being heard.